So this is the widow won, the barkeep lost, using historical context in the fan club to enrich your family stories. So this is a case study that's based off an old family legend on my dad's side of the family, and I wanted to learn more about it when I was a baby genealogist several years ago. So I started with handwritten notes and old poor photocopies of records that my grandma had given me. And here's an example here. And then I kind of used those to eventually write out two stories for the Illinois State Genealogical Society Quarterly. The first one was my very first article, and it was the first research article I had done. And after I wrote that one, I wanted to learn a little bit more about other parts of the story. So I started looking at the point of view of the man and his family who are considered the villains in this story, as we're going to talk about. And I use tools like historical context and the fan club research to broaden out and find other aspects of this story and really use those to. I found a lot of information I wouldn't have found otherwise, and really a lot of interesting stuff that I put into the second article that I wrote. The first one focused on my side of the family story. The other article focused on the defendant's side of the story. As we'll see, this is a court case. And we've probably all felt like the guy in this picture here, where we found a really great family story and we want to share it with everybody, a really cool record, a really good find. And you're talking about it and you look up and everybody's half asleep or, playing on their phone or just not really paying attention. So I'm hoping with this case study, your takeaway will be that you can use historical context and use fan club research as tools in your family history writing toolbox, and they're tools that can really grab readers' interest and help you really broaden out a story so that people can connect to it and want to learn about their family history. So just an overview of what we'll talk about today. I'm going to give you the story in brief first so you understand the background of it. And then we're going to talk about historical context, examples from the story. And then we'll talk about a couple fan club examples from this story. And then I'll go on into the Helmuth story. They're the defendants in this case, and how I put it all together with fan club and historical context to broaden out their side of the story, which was unknown to me until I was really able to use those tools to put things together. And then we'll conclude, and then you can put your questions in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer those. The handout also has a ton of resources and links to many of the things I'll mention today, so make sure you take a look at that, and I hope that those will help you in your research as well. So we'll begin. This is a picture of the Fox River Dam in Yorkville, Illinois. Yorkville is about 50 miles southwest of Chicago, and this is where our story is going to take place. This is that same dam and how it looked in about 1890. And our story begins on May 16th of 1890 along the Fox River and the City Hotel, which was a newly built hotel right along the river near the dam here. Arthur Bell, Archibald, but he went by Arthur, was a recent Irish immigrant to the area, and he had a day off work, so he decided to spend it fishing with a coworker, Frank Griffith, and Arthur's nephew, James Wilcox. The three of them took a boat out to the river, and before they started fishing, they stopped by the City Hotel to grab a keg of beer for their fishing trip. At some point during the afternoon, the tap fell out of the keg and they lost most of the beer. So Arthur went back to shore and purchased a second keg from the City Hotel saloon and brought it back on the boat. Not too long after his purchase, some men who were fishing on shore noticed the three men kind of horsing around in the boat, rocking it back and forth and splashing each other with the oars. What happened next would be considered the, quote, most direful catastrophe that has ever occurred in the history of Yorkville, as before assistance could be rendered, the boat capsized and all three men were drowned. You'll see I mentioned newspapers a lot. The local Kendall County Record newspaper provided a lot of details throughout the accident in this case, and it was a great resource, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The record gave a lot of details as to what happened after the drowning. There were some men on shore who rushed out to try to save Arthur, James, and Frank, but unfortunately they did all drown. They found James first, and then they found Arthur's body by nightfall, and then they had to call off the search due to it getting too dark. They went out the next morning and found Frank Griffith's body. And I believe from the sound of it, they all probably went over the dam. This is a picture just downstream from that same dam in the previous picture. I don't know for sure that this is a photo of the Arthur Bell drowning, but it would have looked very similar to this picture. You can see the dots in the foreground of the picture are a giant net that's dredging the river for bodies. And you can see the crowds on shore. And then this is today Illinois Route 47, but you can see the crowds just gathering to watch the rescue efforts to see what happens. So after the three bodies were recovered, an inquest was held by the coroner, and there were several witnesses brought to testify. Jacob Helmuth, who was the saloon keeper and owner of the City Hotel, stated that he did not see the men drink, but he did know that Wilcox and Bell in particular were in the habit of buying beer. And after speaking to the witnesses, the coroner's jury decided that the deceased came to their death by being accidentally drowned while intoxicated. Frank Griffith was brought back to his native Ohio for burial. James Wilcox and his uncle Arthur Bell were buried in a local cemetery in Kendall County. The services for Arthur and James were presided by the Reverend A.B. Metler, who was very outspoken in his denunciation of those engaged in the saloon business, reminding them that they would be held accountable by God for the lives of these three men. The Reverend's quote would set the scene for what was to come. Sarah Wilcox Bell, my second great grandmother, sued Jacob Helmuth and his wife Albertina for $20,000 in damages over the death of her husband Arthur Bell. She was left a widow with 5 children. The oldest was about 7 or 8 years old, and the youngest was about 6 months when her father died. Sarah and her children were represented by Benjamin Harrington, a local Yorkville attorney. This is a photo of Sarah. I don't have a lot of photos of her. This is one of the good ones I have. This was probably a few years before she passed, probably taken about 1930. So the defendants in this case would be Jacob, often called Jake Helmuth, and his wife Albertina, who were owners of the City Hotel and Saloon in Yorkville, Illinois. There ended up being 2 trials held. The first was held in the spring of 1891, but it resulted in a hung jury, so the judge had to dismiss the case. A second trial was held in neighboring Kane County in the Aurora City Court. Aurora is a larger city upstream of the Fox River, north of Yorkville. And that second case was held in December of 1891. The verdict came in on December 12th, and it was a unanimous judgment for Sarah Bell and her children. They ended up receiving a total of $5,000 in damages, which Sarah used to purchase a nice-sized home in Aurora, and she would raise her children there and rent out extra rooms to boarders. So my family ended up pretty comfortable after this case, and we often spoke about how Sarah was very brave for defending herself and trying to look out for her children by going to court and testifying, and trying to get some justice for this case. And that's pretty much the story as I knew it from my family records. I ended up finding a lot more background and a lot more to this story by using historical context in the fan club. So we're going to start with historical context. This is a quote from Judy Jacobson in History for Genealogists Using Chronological Timelines to Find and Understand Your Ancestors. And this is one of the resources on your handout. Judy says that history lays the foundation to understand why individuals and societies behave the way they do. It provides the building materials needed to understand the human condition and provide an identity, be it for an individual or a group or an institution. I really like this quote, especially her describing historical context as building materials, because you can use different aspects to build out your story. And it helps you understand a person's past and how their history can shape their actions. So, historical context can help make sense of your ancestors' time and place. It can help explain why your ancestors did what they did. It can help support your research conclusions because historical context can function as evidence, especially if you're doing professional genealogy research or applying for BCG certification or something like that. You can use historical context to try to support your case for proof of an ancestor's date of birth, date of death, why they did what they did. And another important thing to remember is that we cannot judge or interpret our ancestors' actions based on modern day context. We need to utilize historical context to fully and correctly tell and understand their stories. Things were different in 1890 than they are now. Things were understood differently. So, learning as much as we can about the time in which our ancestors lived helps us understand them more. So going back to the building materials term, it's a great term because there are different pieces, and some of the pieces of historical context we can build our story with include worldwide or local events. So looking at your ancestors' life from a broader scope, there might be something obvious going on like a world war or a depression, but there might be other events that maybe didn't get as much newspaper coverage but may have impacted your ancestor. Laws of the time is something we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Understanding laws is very important because laws change over time. Politics and movements, labor movements. We're going to talk about a very big movement coming up here in a little bit. That was a big piece of historical context to this story. And then things like technology, transportation, communication. How would your ancestor have reached out to family members? Did they have a radio? Did they write letters? Just little things like that. Even topography and climate are also important because that would affect the way your ancestor lived and maybe what kind of food they could grow if they were farmers. And things like fashion, hairstyles, and entertainment as well. There is Maureen Taylor, the photo detective. She publishes books that talk about how you can identify time periods and photos based on the clothing and the hairstyles people had. And I love those books because it really helps you feel like you're a detective. And that's something that also is a part of historical context to try to put your ancestors in the proper time and place. Another aspect is social and cultural context, which is also a part of historical context. And this is basically how your ancestors interacted with others and identified with a particular group. So you would want to consider social norms of different ethnic groups, how families would celebrate holidays or what holidays they would celebrate, religious customs, which kind of ties into holidays, friendships and communication, which can sometimes be based off culture, and things like hobbies, leisure time, clubs, organizations. These aren't things that are always evident in records like census records or vital records. Sometimes you can find in newspapers if your ancestor was part of a bridge club or a women's club. Here, where I live in Aurora, Illinois, we used to have a lot of different social clubs. There's the Luxembourg Club, which I have an ancestor that was a founding member. The Turner's Club used to be a German social club. And more recently, there are a lot of Hispanic clubs as a lot of Hispanic immigrants from Mexico and other countries came in the early 20th century to this area. So those are things you can look at as well that might not be as obvious, but you can get some context if your ancestor was a member of those groups. So we'll look at a few historical context examples here, and a lot of them pertain to Jake Helmuth and his family, the defendants in our court case. So our bartender was Jake Helmuth. He was born in 1861 in Germany. When he was 21 years old, he journeyed over to America and arrived in New York in 1882. 5 years later, I was able to find his certificate of naturalization in the Kendall County court. So he didn't wait too long to apply for naturalization. He waited the 5 years, which was a standard at the time. So he filed probably not long after he settled, and then after that 5 years, he was able to become a citizen. I was curious as to why Jake chose Kendall County for his place to settle, and I decided to look up a little bit of history about Kendall County just so I could fill in a little bit more background to his story. And I found from a local historian's blog that early settlers to Kendall County were in a large part German and Pennsylvania Dutch. And both groups would, quote, bring their traditions with them. And this was in the 1830s, 1840s when that area was really getting settled by European immigrants. So by the time Jake Helmuth came in the early 1880s, you already had a couple generations of German and Pennsylvania Dutch who spoke German. So he may have known somebody who settled here, or he would have just known that there were people of German descent here and probably felt comfortable and felt welcomed among those settlers. So that might have been part of the reason why he came here. So once Jake settled, he met Albertina Horst Beck, who was a recent widow and was managing a local hotel on her own after her husband had passed. On top of that, she was also raising a few small children of her own with her first husband. Jake and Albertina married in 1883, and about a year later, they welcomed their first son, who has a mouthful of a name, Justus Jacob Wilhelm Helmuth, who was known as Willie in the records. I was curious as to why this child had such a long name. I had heard of German naming traditions, but I wanted to, just get the facts straight. So I used James Fiedler's book, The Family Tree German Genealogy Guide, to learn a little bit more. And James says that by the 19th century, more German families gave children three first names. And it was typical that only one of the middle names was used throughout the individual's life. So in this case, the Justus in the child's name most likely came from Justus Nading. He was Jake's brother-in-law. He was a fellow German immigrant who married Jake's sister Marie Helmuth. Marie came with their mother from Germany about a year and a half after Jake settled. So this was likely an example of chain migration where Jake settled, got everything ready to go, and then let them know, hey, come on over, I have a home for you, and I have a job where I have money coming in. Maybe he might have even sent them money so they could make the journey. And then once Marie settled here, she married Justus. The Jacob, obviously, and the child's name came from the father. So that left Willie. So that's most likely why Willie was known as Willie, because that was his unique name. So, but it was interesting to learn this, and this fact actually came in handy later on as I was searching more about the Helmuth family. So we'll come back to that later. So, a big thing I mentioned was understanding the law in historical context. And again, we want to understand how laws were interpreted or what they meant during our ancestors' time because they change and they might not mean the same thing today. So, just a few places where you can look for information on laws, and these were some of the resources I used for this case. Check your ancestors' county archives for case documents. If you have an ancestor that had a court case in their past, or maybe they were divorced, or they had a criminal case or some sort of civil case, look for those documents. In Illinois, you're going to want to look at the county circuit clerks. We have a county clerk which has vital records, and then the circuit clerk handles court cases of all types. So in this case, I reached out to the Kane County circuit clerk because the second case was held in Kane County and not in Kendall County. All of the records ended up being at Kane County. It was well over 200 pages, but it was definitely worth it as I found so much information there that I would have never found otherwise. Another resource is Kay Frelich and William Freilich's book, Genealogy and the Law, which has a lot of good information about how to use records and where to find them. And then Black's Law Dictionary is the one a lot of genealogists know, and you can find versions of it online. I think there was one I found on Google Books. And then university libraries and local bar association publications, many of them have law review articles available for free online. In a sec here, I'll talk about one that I found on the University of Illinois' law review site, and they're free access, so they're not copyrighted, so you can use those for your research without any copyright concerns. And then again, Google Books, HathiTrust, and WorldCat are other resources you can use to find law articles and find books that talk about laws of the time. So really all good resources. So the big law here that I needed to understand for this case was the Illinois Dram Shop Act. And this law established a liability standard on dram shop operators for torts, which just means injuries or accidents, committed either by an intoxicated patron or in consequence of the intoxication of any person. This law was first enacted in July of 1872 as a penal law, which meant it was supposed to punish offenders, but it was largely considered a remedial law by the courts. So it ended up being used more to recover funds for victims, and the potential recovery was unlimited. There was no cap. So you can see in this case, this is why Sarah Bell used this law because it was considered remedial by that time, where she was looking to recover damages from the accident and her husband's death. So under this law, the Helmuths, Jake and Albertina, were held responsible for the accident, even though neither of them physically sold the liquor to Arthur Bell. Jake's bartender at the saloon was actually the one who sold the liquor, and he would testify in the case later, though they had a hard time dragging him into court, but he did testify. And this original Dram Shop Act, which again, I got this from the UIC Law Review, as I mentioned in the citation there below. Really great resource written by Peter J. Wiffler. He was taking a look at this law and kind of how it changed over the years. And this, he does mention at the end a very good point that this Dram Shop Act was passed in the wake of a national temperance movement spearheaded by the mighty clamor of the women's crusade of the early 1870s. And that brought me to my next big piece of historical context that I needed to understand, which was the temperance movement. The first temperance societies formed in the 1830s and 1840s in the US, and the movement was looking for initially just to decrease the consumption of alcohol or to not promote alcohol as a drink of choice, to promote temperance or the abstaining from alcohol. And the movement collaborated with women's suffrage, immigration, and labor movements. The vast majority of supporters of the temperance movement were women. They were women who had husbands that were alcoholics, had, fathers that were alcoholics, brothers and sons who were, losing jobs because of alcoholism. I read somewhere some fact that in Chicago there were so many saloons on each block prior to the 1900s. It was much more prevalent than it is today, but every block you'd have a saloon. So it was very much more common to drink in those days than we would probably think today. Again, understanding the time and place, the view of alcohol was much different back then. But it was a women's empowerment movement. It was empowering women to speak up against the evils of alcohol, as they called it. So they would support labor movements because they wanted the men in their lives to have good, stable jobs. And often with the immigration, they saw, particularly, unfortunately, in this case, kind of goes with the story, the Irish stereotype of an Irish drunk. And they would look on them with pity and try to encourage them in temperance. But they would also, there were stereotypes of other groups back in those days, but they would try to support immigrants and try to, get them into society and try to teach them that temperance is better than the drinking from your old country. And temperance is what we do here in America. So the first Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was formed in 1874, and the first Illinois chapter was formed that same year in Bloomington, Illinois. And the temperance movement's efforts culminated in the passing of the 18th Amendment and the Prohibition era of the early 20th century. And I found a great book that had a good quote about the temperance movement. Ray Hutchinson's book had a lot of different chapters of talking about different aspects of temperance. But there was a good quote: after the Civil War, emphasis shifted from voluntary abstinence to the forced prohibition of alcohol products. By the end of the 1800s, temperance had evolved from individual commitment to a broader social vision of the ideal community and society. So that's about where we're at in the 1890s. It was more that they were pushing harder to abolish alcohol entirely. They were trying to picture a utopia where there was no drinking, everybody had good jobs, nobody was falling to alcoholism. So it was getting, for lack of a better word, a bit more hardcore at the time of the Bell versus Helmuth case. And we can see that kind of play out in the story as we discuss here in a couple minutes. So, but reading all these resources really gave me a better idea of the temperance movement and how powerful it was at this time. And just a few of the resources I used here. Again, the newspaper was a great resource, this is the Kendall County Record again, and they would have a weekly column called Temperance Notes. And they would talk about different topics. And this one for this particular week was drunkenness. This came out, I think, the week that they reported on Arthur Bell's death, believe it or not. But I would go through and just find different things about the temperance movement locally just to understand how it tied into this case. So that newspapers are our number one resource for reading about the temperance movement. Current day newspapers I use as well because many of them had look back articles talking about prohibition history in their towns and talking about the history of temperance and how it led to that. Again, university archives. The WCTU actually has an archive at the University of Illinois in Champaign. And I looked through their holdings to kind of understand what all they had and how massive it really was. They have a really good sized collection if you're looking to learn more about the WCTU in Illinois. And again, I got books on the history of temperance in Illinois in particular. And then Hattie Trust, I found an anti-WCTU, which was the Liquor Dealers and Manufacturers State Protective Association. So this group was opposed to abolishing liquor, and they actually protected saloon owners and liquor dealers from lawsuits, such as the one that was brought against the Helmuths. And they're mentioned in some of the newspaper reporting, and I have no doubt that they probably were trying to help the Helmuths. So it was interesting to see an article from the other side as well to get like a full view of the picture. So again, Temperance had a big hand in what happened in this case and kind of explained why we had two trials. As I mentioned earlier, we had one in May of 1891 and then one in December. So I wanted to learn more about why did we have two trials and why was there a hung jury. So on Thursday, May 28th of 1891, we had a deadlocked jury after the testimony. There were 6 jurors for the Bell family and 6 that were for the Helmuths. They couldn't get any closer, so the judge had to dismiss the case without a verdict. The Kendall County Record published their report of the proceedings on June 3rd. They were a weekly paper that came out on Wednesdays, I think. So that was the next issue. And the Kendall County Record had quite a bit to say about this case, and they were not afraid to be opinionated. I don't think they knew what objective journalism meant back in those days. But this just tells you kind of the influence of local news reporting and why it's so important to learn more about your ancestors' local newspapers. Just a few snippets that the Kendall County Record reported on in regards to the Bell versus Helmuth case. They claim that the Helmuths hired an attorney employed, it is said, by the State Saloon Keepers Association. They claim that the temperance people failed the Bell family and put all their money into a temperance temple in Chicago instead of towards this case. The judge didn't give the Bell family a fair show, and the trial will be expensive to the taxpayers of Kendall County. But if people will vote to license saloons and wink at evasions of law, they must pay the bills. After this newspaper edition came out, Jake and Albertina were understandably shocked as it was very clear whose side the paper was on. So the couple decided to talk to their neighbors and inquire among the people, quotes from their report to the judge, to find out really what was the stance on the case at this point. They did find in their results that temperance was a hot topic, but the popular opinion was that the Bell family should have won the case. They found that residents had what they called a deep-seated prejudice against all peoples engaged in the business of selling intoxicating liquors. Based on their research, Jake and Albertina got with their lawyers and petitioned for a change of venue for the retrial. They felt that they weren't being treated fairly in Kendall County, and after reviewing the information, the judge agreed. So that is why a second trial was held in the Aurora City Court rather than in Kendall County again. And it all came about because of this June 3rd, 1891 newspaper article. Jake and Albertina did mention that the Kendall County Record had an established circulation of nearly 2,000 copies. The power and influence of said paper has a great deal to do with the foundation of public opinion. So that just shows you in real time that newspapers do have an influence. This was the main way people got their information. This was the where they got their gossip. This is where they got their opinions. This is where they got their straight up news. That everybody read the paper every day. So Jake and Albertina knew this was going to have an influence, and we can see that here. So it's important to make sure you take a look at those local papers and get every scrap of information that you can. I wouldn't have found this and understood why there was a change of venue without really digging into the newspaper and seeing all the work that Jake and Albertina did. So next we're going to look at a couple examples from the fan club. And the term fan club was coined by famed genealogist Elizabeth Shown Mills. If you're not familiar with her, she kind of literally wrote the book on genealogy. She helped edit the book Professional Genealogy and its new edition. And then she wrote a book called Evidence Explained, which is a guide to research and citations for genealogists. So she's very well known in the genealogy community. And fan club stands for friends, associates, and neighbors. And the way Elizabeth Shown Mills explains it is that when those we studied left no document to handily supply the information we seek, we often find it in the records created by members of their fan club, their friends, associates, and neighbors. Investigating the people connected to your ancestor can provide a big payoff. I mean, everybody has family. Sometimes they can be hard to find, but there's aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, siblings, nieces, cousins, neighbors. There's people listed on the census that may have lived next to your ancestor decade over decade. There's witnesses on land transactions or naturalization petitions, on marriage licenses. You can find them everywhere in genealogy records. So you don't want to overlook somebody who could be a key piece to breaking down your brick wall. They can provide clues to additional records to search. And then again, you don't want to fall victim to tunnel vision and research just your ancestors' immediate nuclear family. You want to broaden your search. It's like on a site like Ancestry where you can change your family tree view to just look at the one person and their direct ancestors, or you can broaden it and see all the brothers, sisters, cousins. I prefer to keep the big view because I like to bounce back and forth between those different relatives and see what I can find. So you want to make sure you keep your mind open, take note of any and all names that you find in records, and see what you can find. So our first fan club associate we'll look at is Benjamin F. Harrington, who was the Bell family's lawyer. This is not Benjamin F. Harrington. This is Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch in the film To Kill a Mockingbird. I just was doing research on Harrington, and he just felt like an Atticus Finch to me, so I just wanted to put the picture in for effect. These are just a few quotes. I really couldn't find a bad word said about the man. He was highly respected in the community. He was called persevering and tenacious. It was said his whole heart was in the Bell family's case. And he had the reputation of being the best technical lawyer, not only in Kendall County, but this part of the state. When he is retained on either side of a matter in court, there is going to be a lawsuit unless his opponent brings forward a flag of truce. So in my first round of research for my first article about my family side of the case, I wanted to learn more about Harrington just to, understand maybe his influence on the case, just to add some more color to the story and see what I could find. So I found that he was born in Ontario in 1848 and his family moved to Detroit, Michigan. He enlisted as a drummer boy in the Civil War at the age of 13, then served in the 11th Michigan Infantry. He was admitted to the bar on July 4th of 1876, the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. I don't think you can get more patriotic than that. He continued to practice law in Yorkville until at least 1914, is as far as I could find him in the records as a local lawyer. He also served as adjutant for his local Grand Army of the Republic post in Yorkville. He died in 1924 and is buried at West Aurora Cemetery, which is known to be a Civil War veteran cemetery. There's a memorial to GAR members there, and that's where he's buried. So just from this snapshot, I get a very patriotic, very American view of him. He was born in Canada, but he was a true patriot. He was a veteran. So probably a lot of people in the Yorkville community respected him for serving, especially if he really did serve so young. to do his part in the war, and then was able to get admitted to the bar on the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. So it did seem that this kind of contributed to why people very highly respected him in the community. And, people probably believe that anybody who's being represented by Harrington deserved a fighting chance. So just a few of the resources I used for Benjamin were typical ancestry resources, Find a Grave, Ancestry, Family Search, things you can find online. One thing I wanted to mention was they're sometimes called brag books, but there's a lot of them for Illinois counties. They're the Historical Encyclopedia of Illinois series, and they cover numerous counties in Illinois. I used the one for Kendall County, which came out in 1914, and this is when Benjamin was still an active lawyer in Yorkville. They're sometimes called brag books because they include profiles of early local pioneers, and these are often recounted to the author by the pioneers themselves or descendants of the pioneers. So you kind of have to take what they say with a grain of salt and corroborate what you find with other records. A lot of Illinois counties were settled in the early to mid 1800s, so there's a good chance you can find records to kind of back up what they're saying in these books. And then some of them are kind of folk tales and things where it's like, you don't know for sure, but it's kind of fun to read about them. But I found a lot of information about Benjamin and his law practice in this book since he was well known in the community. So definitely, especially in Illinois, but I'm sure they have them for other states, take a look at those historical, like county histories, and you can find a lot of great information about the history of the area there. And then one other thing I haven't got a chance to do, but I'd like to, is to review other cases that Harrington handled over the years, just to try to get a better picture of the types of people he served and like how he acted in all those different cases, just to broaden my picture of him. And honestly, I really couldn't find a bad word said about Harrington at all, except for one thing, and this was during the second trial in December of 1891. And it was the fact that lawyer Harrington allowed a man to go on the jury who was prejudiced against the dram shop law was a mistake and will be fatal to his case. I think I skipped over it earlier, but when I was talking about the second trial in December, the newspapers mentioned that there was a juror who held out until the last moment and they said he was kind of forced into line by the other 11. So it sounded like it was almost going to be a no-go for the Bell family, except this juror finally changed his mind at the end. So that made me decide to look at the juror as my second fan club associate because I wanted to find out, okay, this is interesting. What exactly happened? And boy, did I find a lot of information about this guy. So this is M.E. Plain. He is our infamous juror. And to research this particular person, I actually went in with Harrington. I just was just looking for more information in general. With Plain, I actually kind of had a goal. I wanted to know, why was he chosen as a juror if he claimed to be prejudiced? And was he connected to the Helmuths in some way? And did something happen to cause this juror to change his mind? Because they kept saying he was forced into line. So did something happen? And if so, what? This is another newspaper clipping that mentions it. It was mentioned in most newspapers that there was because it was just very dramatic because it was like, is she going to win the case? And it was kind of an 11th hour decision for this juror to change his mind. So first, I went to the court documents to see if I could find any information there about this juror Plain. And on December 8th, 1891, the jury selection for the trial took case. And this was at the Aurora City Court. Benjamin Harrington raised an objection because he discovered that juror Emmy Plain was acquainted with Jake and Albertina Helmuth. A cross-examination revealed that Plain had in fact been friends with Albertina for 20 years. But Plain assured the court that he would view the case as though the parties were perfect strangers to him, his words. The judge ruled at that point that it was too late to dismiss Plain. The jury's been selected and approved. They've already been sworn in. Let's just get the show on the road. So Harrington's objection was overruled. So the case went pretty quickly. Testimony concluded 3 days later on December 11th, and the jury was sent to deliberate overnight. Early the next afternoon, which was Saturday, December 12th, 1891, M.E. Plain suddenly came out of the jury sequester room and asked the deputy sheriff standing guard to accompany him over to the German American Bank in downtown Aurora to, quote, directly from it, transact private business. with his brother J.H. Plain. His request was granted and he was inside the bank for no more than 2 minutes. And this was per the sheriff's sworn affidavit recounting the events. Plain returned to the jury room, and that evening, a few hours later, the 12-0 verdict was presented in favor of the Bell family. So at this point, I need to learn more information because this was very unusual, and it seems like something fishy might have been going on between the Plain brothers. So, I mean, how often do you hear jurors being allowed out of sequester to go talk to their brother at the bank? Like, that doesn't even happen today. So I decided to start researching the Plain family and just to see what I could find about them. So I started with a simple ancestry search and just searched for M. Plain in Yorkville and the surrounding counties. And city directories were really my big resource here to learn more about the various Plain family members and kind of learn where they were living, how well off they were, what did they do. A good tip here for researching fan club associates, throw together a quick and dirty family tree, whether it's on Ancestry, Family Search, whatever you prefer to use your own software. Just throw them in a tree. You can throw the names on there, start connecting records. That way you can keep track of things and not lose information. And in this case, that's basically what I did to kind of put the Plain family together. So I found information about John Plain, who was Emmy Plain's father, and then M. Plain himself, whose name was Michael, and then his several brothers. And I found in an 1880 Aurora City directory that John Plain was a wine and liquor wholesale dealer. So this would explain most likely why the Plain family knew Albertina is because they probably sold the liquor to the hotel. And most likely in 1880, they were selling to Albertina's husband, George Beck, as he died in 1883 and Albertina took over the hotel. So that's probably how Albertina knew the family is they probably were business associates. So Albertina took over the hotel in 1883. They probably still use the Plains for their liquor dealing, and that's probably how Jake met him. So that was a big clue as to how they knew each other. And I ended up finding out that the Plain family was quite well to do in Aurora. John Plain ended up being president of the German American National Bank, and J.H. Plain, the brother that Michael left the jury sequester to see, was the bank cashier. So that's a pretty top role in the bank. And then another brother, Henry Plain, was the bank's bookkeeper. Michael would actually go on to succeed his dad as president of the bank by 1910, as I found him in the directory. But at this time in 1891, he co-owned what they called a jewelry house in downtown Aurora and sold finery such as lamps, bronzes, statuary, fine canes and umbrellas, and silverware. And what a coinky dink, Frank Plain, the last brother, was a lawyer. Not the brother that was mentioned on seeing, but maybe he was at the bank that day. We really don't know. So I ended up not being able to find out what actually transpired at the bank on December 12th, 1891, but this just gave me some more information on the background. Based on what I found, I knew that the Plain family was very well-to-do and probably well-known in Aurora, which means they probably had a reputation that they wanted to uphold. So that might in part explain why Plain may have changed his verdict at the end because he didn't want his family looked upon badly and he wanted to save his reputation. However, because I am a professional genealogist, I don't offer any opinions when I write my article. I just offer the facts and just allow the reader to speculate. However, that is my opinion here off the record as to what I think might have happened is just they were well to do and had a reputation to uphold. But it was very interesting to learn about all of this and it really gives more color to the story. And again, I wouldn't have found all of this information without doing that fan club research on the Plain family. So it was definitely worth it. So understandably, once the verdict was rendered, the Helmuths were outraged, especially when they found out that Plain was allowed to leave jury sequester. They filed an appeal with their attorneys and attempted to even prepare new talking points for a retrial. The lawyer was actually looking at a couple different things that they didn't look at the first time around, such as the condition of the boat that the men were out when they drowned, among other things. So it was kind of interesting to read about that. However, the judge at that point was done, and he denied their attempt for a retrial after reviewing the deputy sheriff's affidavit, where the deputy sheriff said, no, no, he was only in there for 2 minutes and I watched him the whole time. And that was good enough for the judge, unfortunately. But fortunately for my family, the 5,000 in damages was paid to the Bell family. And that was the end of the case. The Helmuths were ordered to pay. So that was the end of it for my side of the family, but I wanted to learn more about the Helmuths, and unfortunately, they did not have a happy story after this. They were bankrupt. They couldn't repay the defendant's bond that a couple of their friends had fronted the cash for, so they were forced to sell the City Hotel in 1892. They moved to Chicago for about a year or so, and Jake managed another saloon, but it was a short-lived venture. They were back in Yorkville by 1893. And in November of that year, their 9-year-old son, the one we mentioned earlier with the long name, Willie Helmuth, who was called a bright, smart lad, died in November of inflammation of the bowels. He was buried in a local Yorkville cemetery. He was the first child to die. The family lived in Aurora by 1900, several years later, and Jake was now a traveling salesman, so I guess he figured there was no future in the saloon business and he was out for good. 13-year-old Mamie Helmuth, their second child, died in November 1900, 7 years after Willie. However, I noticed in the census records it indicated she was a lifelong invalid with spinal trouble, so she probably had been suffering or perhaps in a wheelchair most of her life. That left one remaining child, their youngest, who Lily Helmuth, who was about a year younger than Mamie. So about 6 months after the 1900 census was taken, or 6 months after Mamie died, the family was still living in Aurora. And they had, of course, one more tragedy, as if that wasn't enough. On April 10th, 1901, neighbors found Mrs. Albertine Helmuth dead in her bed, and her 13-year-old daughter just alive. A partially closed hard coal heating stove discharging gas into the closed room. This was likely to blame for the death of Albertina. Another quick historical context, I looked up coal gas, and it is most likely carbon monoxide gas that, and based on how they found them, was most likely the culprit. Lily fortunately did recover, according to the article. She recovered in the local hospital, and Jacob wasn't there. He was a traveling salesman, and he was way out in Sterling, Illinois at that time. Albertina was bedridden at that point, so her health wasn't that good. So Lily was taking care of her, and it mentioned she couldn't even get around without crutches. So it was just the two of them on their own when this unfortunately happened. It was even mentioned, just heartbreaking in the article, Jake was actually going out to Sterling in part to get medicine for Albertina, which he wouldn't need anymore, sadly. So Jake buried his wife of 17 years alongside their two children in Yorkville. And that is where the records ended for Jake Helmuth and Lily Helmuth. I hit a brick wall at this point, and I couldn't find any more records for them. Lily was 13 at the time, so I figured she probably had gotten married by the time of the 1910 census, so that would explain it if I don't know any more information about who she married. I hit a brick wall, but I couldn't find anything for Jake, which I thought was puzzling. So I ended up using some of Jacob's identifying characteristics and fan club research and a bit of cultural context to finally get the last chapter of his story put together. About 6 months after the coal gas, oh, not even 3 months after the coal gas accident on 18 July 1901, Frederick J. Helmuth married Ida Nasca in the Champaign County Courthouse in Urbana, Illinois. I happened to find this record just by doing a wildcard search in Ancestry. That's where you'll type in part of a name and put an asterisk instead of the rest of the spelling just to see what comes up because as we know, ancestors' names are never consistently spelled in the records. And I had seen Helmuth spelled with one L and two L's. Jake pretty consistently was referred to with one L, but then I noticed this Frederick Helmuth had two L's in his name and his was always with two L's in all the records I found, but I wouldn't have found this without doing that wildcard search. But I noticed on the license return for the marriage license, a lot of similarities between Frederick and Jacob, and here's just a close-up. Frederick was the same age as Jake would have been, 40. Ida was 22 and from Chicago. It mentioned that they were both from Chicago at that time. But I threw together a quick chart, and this is a good way to compare information as you're doing research, and found a lot of similarities. Their place of birth the same, parents' names very similar. Fred was actually, he was often called Fred in the records. Fred was a traveling salesman for a grocery house, and this is the same occupation that Jake was mentioned having in the coal gas article in April. So I was like, okay, this definitely sounds like it might be the same guy, but it's a totally different first name. So I still wanted to find a concrete piece of evidence to prove that these two men were the same. And Jake, or Fred, ended up moving out to Hand County, South Dakota, and he died in 1915. Him and Ida settled out there. He might have found an opportunity for, it was kind of an up and coming railroad community at that time, so there might have been grocery stores being built, so a good opportunity for a grocery salesman. But they ended up having 3 children. But Jake unfortunately died in July of 1915, and I was able to get his death certificate from the kind folks at the South Dakota State Historical Society. And that is where I discovered that Fred's full name was Frederick Jacob Helmuth. So I was like, aha. And then I remembered the German naming traditions where German children often had 3 first names. I remembered that in some of the earlier records for Jake, he was referred to as F.W. Jacob Helmuth. So what do you want to bet? His name was Frederick Wilhelm Jacob Helmuth. So that was a big clue to tie it all together that these were one and the same man. But it also made me wonder, why would he suddenly go by one name where he was always known as Jake? I found no records referring to him as Fred before 1901 and found no records referring to him as Jake from 1901 to 1915. So again, I just speculate, and when I wrote that second article, that this man had gone through tragedy upon tragedy, and maybe he was just looking for a fresh start by going with a different name. I don't know if he met Ida before or after Albertina died. That's kind of up to debate, but that may be how she knew him as that name, so he decided to stick with it. But you honestly can't blame the man for everything that he went through, for wanting to have a fresh start and get away from the tragedy that came about from that court case that my great great grandmother brought, back in 1891. So again, I don't have concrete information, but having this background and doing this research and understanding all the characteristics I found about Jake from doing all of that historical background helps me kind of tie things together and try to bring, some information in just to have readers think, what might have happened. And then I finally did find my piece of concrete evidence. Fred's obituary in the local paper in South Dakota. It was Miller, South Dakota, in Hand County. I think I might have had it flip-flopped. But it's mentioned that those who were surviving to mourn his loss included a daughter, Mrs. George Sargent, and this was Lily. She married very young. She married at 15, so that's why I couldn't find her in the records. I would have never known this was her without this obituary mention. I would have never found her. But with that name, George Sargent, I was able to connect her and find records and ancestry for her family. She lived, I think, in Pontiac, Illinois, and she had several kids. So she ended up being okay. She remarried later in life, but I was able to find more information about her based on this one piece of information, this one record. And then it also mentions Maria Nading, who was the sister of Jake that we mentioned earlier, married to Justus Nading. And it mentions his aged mother, who is Henrietta Helmuth. She came with Maria when they settled back in 1883, and she actually died a few months after Fred/Jake. I noticed in her obituary when I found it that Jake/Fred wasn't mentioned at all, and this is probably why, because he predeceased her, so that's probably why he wasn't mentioned. But this little piece of information was what I needed as a smoking gun, so to speak, to prove that Jake Helmuth and Fred Helmuth were one and the same. And just a little last thing, this was really the only piece of information I got about Jake that had nothing to relate it to a court case or vital records or just like black and white facts. He was an industrious man so long as health permitted, of a genial nature, and well liked by those who knew him. So at least I knew that he was loved and he had a family. He was able to start his life over. I think I might have skipped over a slide. when I clicked, but he did have 3 sons who lived full lives, along with Lily, so he had 4 surviving children. His oldest son was named Justus George Helmuth, so he named his oldest son with Ida, his second wife, after his firstborn son with Albertina. So he did have that name go on to honor the son that had passed 20 some years earlier. So just to conclude, doing my research, I had reached out to a descendant of Lily Helmuth Sargent. This person was a third great grandchild of Jake and Albertina. So I'm a second great grandchild of Arthur and Sarah Bell. So she was just a generation under me. I had reached out just to see if she had any information about Jake, especially pictures, because I didn't have any photos of him at all, and it would have been cool to have one. She really had no records at all. She barely knew anything about him. So I told her, I'm writing a draft of this story for, the state journal. I'd like to send you a copy since you don't know anything about this side of your family and don't know anything about this story. So she got back to me and said, "This is amazing. I cried reading and am so thankful you reached out. Thank you so much." I shared with my grandpa, who's the second great grandchild, or actually great grandchild of Lily Sargent, and he is also amazed. So this wasn't just my story, this was her story too. Our families were intertwined at some point in the late 19th century, and because of this court case, our families' lives ended up becoming what they are today. So I just was so glad I was able to share this with her so she could understand. And I was glad I did this historical context and this fan club research into the Helmuth side of the story so she could get that part of her family story back. So it made me really happy. So to conclude, this is the power of family stories. You should write your story because you never know who it's going to impact and who it's going to touch. So I hope that you learned a little bit about historical context in the fan club in here and how you can use them to enliven your family stories. And don't be afraid to publish your stories. Look for local journals or journals in the area your ancestors were from. They love to have stories, especially the Illinois State Genealogical Society. We'd love to have your Illinois stories. And I hope that these facts will help your readers connect to your story. So thank you very much.
We are a little bit short on time, so I'm just gonna, and luckily we only have a few questions, so I'm gonna
Okay,
read through these pretty
sure.
quickly. But the first one I'm curious about as well. How long did you work on this story?
Long time. The first article I wrote in 2018, the ISGS Quarterly was having a writing contest, so I submitted it for the contest. I didn't win, but it kind of taught me a lot about writing a family history. And then I kind of just was researching off and on for a few more years. And then our last editor was getting ready to retire, and he was looking for a story to, put in his last issue because he had some space. So I mentioned this one I had. The one about the Helmuths was a bit long because I kind of recapped the court case and what happened on my side, and then the rest of it was what happened with the Helmuths that I didn't mention the first time. But he had space for it, so I went and I kind of tidied up my research, got as many photos as I could. Those photos I showed at the beginning were from a book I found at the Oswego Public Library. They have a good Kendall County collection, especially that photo of the people standing by the river watching the net dredging. I feel like it might be from this case, but I don't have any proof. It just says it's pre 1914. And they're not the only people that have drowned. It's kind of a dangerous dam there. But just to kind of give you a really good visual of what was going on, people just kind of standing there watching. So the answer is a lot of hours. But I enjoyed it. It was just so interesting. All the different, I would come and run, tell my husband, like, did you hear? I got to tell you about this Michael Plain. This is crazy. You know?
That is wonderful. Well, it's easy to see how you got invested. It was a
Yeah.
fascinating story. The next question is, in the court case, originally I thought they asked for $20,000. How come they only got 5,000?
I think she put that's a very large amount in 1890s money. It would be, I think, several thousand. I mentioned there's a historical currency converter that I used. The 5,000 in that money was about 130 grand, in 1891 money. So I think she was probably told by the attorney to put a very large amount up, knowing they weren't going to get that much, and that it would eventually be talked down. And then the 5,000, like I said, was a pretty considerable sum for the time. So I think it was just maneuvering by the lawyer. I never found out for sure, but I think that's what it was. That's the amount of the bond she took out.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then, ooh, okay, last question. What resources would you use to find information on an aunt that worked as a cook in a high-end Chicago hotels for
Ooh.
weddings between 1920s and 1940s?
I would try to use city directories to get some info, but I would honestly say go to the Chicago Genealogical Society. You can Google them. They have a really great website and they excel at getting kind of unusual records like that. Their members are super knowledgeable. I know several of them are super knowledgeable in getting stuff like that. So I would probably go to them for advice and tell them what you're looking for, and they might be able to put you in the right direction because there's local guides and things like that that are unusual, but you might find them on some random website, not necessarily Ancestry, and they'll tell you where to look. So definitely contact Chicago Genealogical for sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure,
Okay, it looks like we flew through those, so thank you. And thank you again, Candace, for a wonderful presentation.
absolutely.
Again, everybody who attended, this was recorded, so it will be on the YouTube channel later if you'd like to watch it again, or even encourage one of your friends to watch it at a later date because you enjoyed it so much. So please go ahead and let us know if you guys have any questions. You can email us at genealogy@acpl.info, or if you would like to request a copy of the chat. So that is genealogy@acpl.info. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Candace, and have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.